chapter 1, verses 3 through 4. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God.
Hey, good morning and welcome on this chilly, brisk, beautiful Sunday. Thank you for being here and worshiping with us. This particular lesson, we're moving through promises, different promises that God has given us this month. And, well, He's given it to us all month, but this month, that's what we're talking about. And we're talking about comfort. And this lesson's for everybody, but especially if you've ever been in that state. And you know what I'm talking about. That time of darkness and loathing. The time in your life when you are in the pit and the valley. You find yourself seemingly gasping for air, with a numbness of life, and the sun's shining, but it's not there in your life. If you've ever found yourself in that state, and I think most of us have, this hopefully is especially meaningful for you. We're going to look at 3 different passages this morning as we think about the comfort that God gives us and different ways in which He has given us His comfort, and it's manifested in our life and manifested in the lives of those who've gone on before us. But the comfort of God it's unsurpassed. And you find yourself, right, in the valley and the darkness, and it is so bleak and a terrible experience, perhaps life-changing experience. And the only way to get out of it is by looking up, by finding some rock of refuge and rock of strength, that Ebenezer that will allow you to climb out of the darkness with the strength of the almighty hand. In my opinion, I don't think there's a more beautiful passage than what Paul writes here in 2 Corinthians, what Zach just read for us, 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verses 3 and 4. In that passage, it describes God, Paul, via the Spirit, right, describes God as the God of all comfort. It's as if He is saying, there is no comfort apart from me. Like you can try to find solace and peace in a whole host of things in this life, but ultimately there is no comfort. There is no peace, and there's no tranquility in those things. God of all comfort. And what He does, and we'll talk about this as we move through this lesson, but what He does is that He comforts us with a purpose. It's like when somebody shakes your hand with a deal and they're like, yeah, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. Right? This is kind of like that. Because God shakes our hand and says, I'm the God of all comfort, and I will comfort you, who comforts us in our affliction, right? So that we may be able to comfort others who are in any affliction. So the comfort that God gives us, He gives us so that we can help other people, so that we can reach out. I know for a fact that you have gone through things in your life that I have not yet gone through. I will, and there's going to come a time when I will go through those things, but I haven't yet. And you've gone through those things, and you have been in the valley, you've been in the darkness, and you have climbed out of that with the help of God. And I will need that. So God comforts us in our affliction so that we can comfort those who are in any type of darkness. What a beautiful thought. The God of all comfort. There's comfort in that is found in God that cannot be found anywhere else. We see one of our favorite, and perhaps one of the most quoted Psalms of all time is Psalm 23. And in Psalm 23, we see that God gives us comfort in His protection. Right? Let's read Psalm 23. It's not very long, familiar to many people. Psalm chapter 20, or whatever it is, the 23rd Psalm. And it's interesting, and one of the crazy things about this is that if you remember, David is a shepherd, right? He was raised as a shepherd. He spent most of his time, young adult life and adolescence, out in the field with the sheep. He knows what he's talking about, and the metaphor, it would seem as if it came easy for him. But he begins by saying, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters." And you can see it, can't you? You can see the green pastures, and you can see the quiet brook and the place where the water pools. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows, and surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. There's a reason we love that passage, isn't it? How beautiful. And then if we're going to hone in on verse 4 there in the middle of that, for even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that's where we're at this morning. That death, that pit, that valley when we find ourselves in darkness. And he says, even though I walk right through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And then he elaborates and he says that the comfort in the valley, right? The comfort comes from God. In particular, as God is our shepherd, it comes from two things which God, our shepherd, carries. One, His rod, and the second, His staff. Now, if you remember, it's probably been 3 years ago, David led us in a Bible study here in the auditorium about the 23rd Psalm, and we spent quite a bit of time on that. There's a book, and David referenced this a couple of times, but there's a book called A Shepherd's Look by Philip Keller, A Shepherd's Look at the 23rd Psalm, which is exquisite, and it's a well-written, easy-to-read book looking at this passage. And he talks in that book, he talks about the rod and the staff that the shepherd would carry. That rod it would seem as if the shepherd would select this rod. He would go to a particular plant, a woody plant, and he would go to that plant and he would get that root ball from that plant. And that root ball, that root was large, and as most roots are, bigger than what is up top. He would carve out a ball, a circular place, and that stem would be the long part. And that ball, as it was carved and shaped, specially chosen by the shepherd, that served several purposes. It was a club, is what it turned out to be, more or less. And that shepherd, if a sheep was wandering towards something that was not supposed to be eaten, like a poisonous plant or something that was going to make it sick, these shepherds would spend, as Philip Keller talks about, these shepherds would spend hours, and they would even make up competitions about throwing that rod. And the accuracy with which they threw it was, as he describes it, fascinating and a pleasure to watch. So they would take this rod as a shepherd sees the sheep wandering from where it's supposed to be. They would take that rod and thunk, get that sheep back to where it needs to be. It was a tool used to, first of all, discipline, right? If you see a sheep doing what it's not supposed to be doing, maybe bullying other sheep or going where it's not supposed to be going, that rod would come in handy real fast. A thing of discipline and protection. But also there's another interesting aspect to that rod, because it would be used to examine the sheep and even count and separate the sheep. And if you remember, there's a passage somewhat obscure in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 37 in describing how we pass under the rod of God. And the distinction there between God's people and those who are not God's people, the shepherd would take the rod, and obviously you're familiar with sheep. They've got fur, all right? No surprise. And that fur gets thick, no surprise. But as it gets thick, it gets harder and harder to see what's going on under the fur. So that staff or that rod would serve as a tool to sort of comb through that sheep's wool to make sure that there wasn't anything going on under the surface. So God's rod comforts us. Because God, if you'll allow me, when we're getting out of line, you dummy, what are you doing? And he also uses it to make sure that we're okay. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, the staff, on the other hand, that's what we're most familiar with. And they sell, even you can find them at most garden stores, it's called a shepherd's hook, right? You hang the plants on it. Well, that's what it is. It's a shepherd's hook. So the staff would be the hook that the shepherd uses. And as Keller describes the use of the staff, he talks about how he would take these newborn sheep, and he would make sure that baby lamb was with his mother. Because the problem is that you don't want to pick that thing up with your smelly hands and the mother reject that. That's not mine. It doesn't smell right. So the shepherd would take that lamb and pick it up with that shepherd's hook and make sure that it stayed next to its mother. It would draw the sheep close together and make sure that it was there. It would also serve as sort of a guide to make sure that the sheep was going where he was supposed to be going. He tells a story about how certain sheep, obviously you get close to, and that's all you see all day. But certain sheep, they needed a special attention. And one way of doing that is a shepherd would gently put the end of his staff on the side of that sheep, just so the sheep knows, here I am. It's okay. And there's other times when he describes when a sheep wanders off, and there's a clump of grass that's growing in the thorn thicket. And guess what that silly sheep does? Well, there's green grass over there. I got to go eat it. So the sheep wanders into that thorn thicket, and how do you get this woolly beast out of a thorn thicket? You pick him up, carry him out, you drag him out. How? With that shepherd's hook. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, because I know that you're going to guide me. I know that you're going to deliver me, that you're going to rescue me, that you're going to save me. I know your presence as you press against my side, gently letting me know that you're there. Your rod and your staff, they protect me. Even though I'm in the valley, God's protection gives us comfort. Then if you turn with me to 2 Corinthians, which is where we were in our scripture reading, what Zach read for us. And we began in chapter 1, but go to the very last chapter in chapter 13. And here we find there's comfort in God's people. And we alluded to that in verse 3 and verse 4, but there is certainly comfort in the people of God. Here are, as Paul, this is the last chapter and one of the last verses that Paul writes to the church at Corinth. And in verse 11, right, final instructions. These are the things that I want to remind you before I go. Remember, this is what he says. Finally, brothers, rejoice. Aim for restoration. Comfort one another. Live in peace. And the God of love and peace will be with you. Comfort one another. Why should we comfort one another? How should we comfort one another? What are those situations in which we should comfort one another? Well, we already looked at one of those, right? In chapter 1, Paul describes the affliction that he was going through. And the comfort that we should have for one another is when we are going through affliction. Now, Paul, he's talking undoubtedly about persecution. When you're going through persecution, hey, if you're a part of God's church, you're not going through that persecution alone. You're not going through this life alone. You see in verse 5 through verse 7, which we haven't read yet, for as we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. If we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation. And if we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we suffer. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that you share in our sufferings. You will also share in our comfort. You see, we comfort one another as we go through those afflictions, because we know as we see someone else going through that valley, we know that when I get there, I can go through it too. I saw how they came out. And I see their faith stronger now than it was when they started. I can see that. And I can see how God has worked in them. So when we are comforted, as we go through those afflictions, as we suffer, there is comfort that we give one another. And obviously, if we get comfort, there's comfort there too. And that's what Paul's saying there in verse 6. We comfort one another in affliction. We also comfort one another as we go through sin and bad situations. Because you remember, not just the affliction, but as we were looking at 1 Corinthians, there was this, in chapter 5, there was this fella, no good, dirty, rotten scoundrel. And you remember what he was doing. He was having sexual relations with his father's wife. You remember that. And Paul, several occasions there in 1 Corinthians, he tells them, have nothing to do with such people. Remove that person from yourself, because they were celebrating the sin that was there. Look at how gracious God is. Look, even this guy, he's here. He's doing something that nobody would do. And God is gracious to him. So we comfort one another in forgiveness. Because when we sin, there is forgiveness. And apparently, as we read 2 Corinthians, it would seem as if the church at Corinth had taken that so seriously, which is good, but that they had continuously shunned that person, that they would not have anything to do with him, even after he stopped and came back to the Lord. And that's what we read here in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. If you begin, and we're not going to read it, but if you begin in verse 5 and go through verse 11, Paul encourages them, hey, if someone stops sinning and they come back to God, you need to forgive that person. They've gotten their life right with God. What's it to you? Forgiveness. And there's comfort in forgiveness. There's comfort in forgiving one another and moving past it. You see there in verse, let me find it, 5, 6, or 7. So you should rather turn, verse 7, to forgive and comfort him. That's a beautiful thing about the church, is that there's comfort. When we sin, and we all sin. That's why we're here, isn't it? Because none of us are perfect. We all need the grace of God. But when we sin, you are a part of a family that can comfort you. We also see that we get comfort from one another when we are together, when we experience this togetherness. I don't know about you, and I know I say this every Sunday. Like it's good to see you. All right, John. Stop talking, get on with it. But man, it is good to see you. I truly mean it, because I can look out and I see you and I know you and I know, hey, we're all on the same path. We all want the same thing. And there's comfort in being together and having the same goal. And that's why God has created the church, because we need each other. Can you imagine going through this life by yourself? Can you imagine going through all the situations, and we're talking about the valleys, all the bad things in this life, and going through it by yourself? It's a whole lot easier to go through it with each other, isn't it? And Paul writes about this in here again in 2 Corinthians in chapter 7, when he's talking about how Titus, he's getting comfort from Titus because Titus is coming to him in verse 6 and verse 7. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. How great is that? There's comfort in one another and being together. Being together gives us comfort. So you arrive at the end of this, and we've seen comfort all through, haven't we, 2 Corinthians? But you arrive at the end of it, and isn't it poignant now? Comfort one another. We need comfort from God's people. There's also here in Matthew chapter 14, that's where we're going next. But in Matthew chapter 14, we get comfort from the presence of God. The protection of God, Psalm 23. The people of God here in 2 Corinthians chapter 13. Actually, all of 2 Corinthians. But we get comfort in the presence of God here in Matthew chapter 14. But before we get there, allow me to set the scene. Because here we are talking about one of the most famous days, one of the most famous days in Jesus' ministry. The day was drawing to a close, the sun was setting, and the disciples were getting worried. Because following Jesus was thousands of people. And in my mind, I try to imagine what that must have looked like for thousands of people to follow Jesus. And in fact, it says in Matthew chapter 14 that there are 5,000 people following him. No, it doesn't say that. There are 5,000 men following him. And Matthew goes on to say, not including the women and children. I grew up in our county seat, the city that was, where the courthouse was. That particular town was 3,000. I can't imagine 5,000, probably more like 7,000 people following Jesus. So you can imagine as the day is drawing to a close and they're out in this desolate place and the disciples are thinking, all right, these people need to get home. We're getting hungry. And I hate to eat in front of all these people. So they tell Jesus, hey, you need to send these people home so that they can get food. Then you remember the scene. Jesus tells the disciples, you get them food. I don't know what you're talking about. We can't get food for all these people. I mean, thousands of people. Even if we had all the way, I mean, there's no. And you remember Jesus, 5 loaves, right? 5 pieces of bread and 2 fish is what they scrounge up from 5,000 people. They arrive with 5 loaves and 2 fish from a little boy that Andrew brought. All right, this is what we got. Everybody can have a scale. And Jesus, blesses it and breaks the bread, and they take up 12 basketfuls of leftovers. And then after that, Jesus sends the disciples away in a boat. And in Matthew chapter 14, Jesus is not with them at this moment. And there's a storm that pops up as they are leaving. Now, you remember some of these guys are fishermen. They're not totally unfamiliar with storms on the sea. Jesus had gone up to the mountain to pray, to be by himself after the crowd. And then it was between 2 or 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, if you're up between 2 and 3 and 6 o'clock, it's dark, all right? And the disciples are in the midst of this storm, and all of a sudden, there's somebody walking on the water. All right, that doesn't happen every day. He's walking on the water, and their first thought, hey, it's a ghost. There's a ghost walking on the water. Now, I don't know how sleepy they must have been to arrive at that conclusion that it's got to be a ghost. And then in verse 27, Matthew 14, Jesus spoke to them, and he says this, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." That phrase of take heart that is used 5 times in the New Testament, 4 by Jesus. Take heart, do not be afraid. There's comfort in the presence of the Lord, isn't there? Just knowing that it's the Lord soothes the soul. But there's a problem because the story doesn't end here. I mean, that would be great. Jesus gets in the boat and all is well. But Peter says, out of doubt, curiosity, or whatever, "Lord, if it is you, let me come out to you." It's like, if you can walk on the water, I can walk on the water. There's fear in the unknown. You see that? Because Peter, he wasn't necessarily confident in that being Jesus. And sometimes when we are in that valley, there are unknowns. And as Peter faces, "It is I, do not be afraid," I'm pretty sure that's a ghost. He's afraid of what might be out there. If it is you. He doesn't say, "Lord, since since it is you, if it is you, let me come out there. So Peter gets out of the boat. You know the rest of the story. He gets out of the boat and he begins walking on the water, which is miraculous in and of itself. But if you remember what he says, or what it says here, let's go back to verse 29 and read verse 30. He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But there it is in verse 30. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." He's scared again. He's scared of the unknown. Lord, if it is you, and he's scared of what he can see, and he's scared of what is known. And isn't that fascinating? We're fickle, aren't we? Because we're scared of what we can't see, and we're scared of what we do see, right? Have you ever been there? And Peter is there by all means. He sees the wind. Question: it's 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the morning. How in the world does he see wind? I've never seen wind in my life, but I've seen the effects of wind. So you can imagine the waves, right? The waves that are crashing around Peter, the boat tossing, and then he begins to sink. And he calls out to the Lord, "Lord, save me." Maybe that's where you're at. Maybe you're with Peter. There's a fear of the unknown. There's a fear of what is known. I don't know where you're at. But I know that when you call out to the Lord will save you, just as he saved Peter. Jesus immediately in verse 31 reached out his hand and took hold of him. He'll do the same thing. The God of all comfort. How beautiful. Maybe you need comfort this morning. Maybe you need comfort in your salvation and you're not confident in your salvation. You're not real sure whether you're saved or not. We can talk about that. And the Lord can take care of that. Maybe you've begun to sink and you just need some comfort and some prayers of the people of God. Or maybe you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death and you need the protection of God. He's more than willing to give it. If you need it, please come as we stand and as we sing.